Keep the excitement of the NBA season rolling with FanDuel. New customers.
This is the story of the Hinterkaifeck. Someone or some shows up on this farm and it doesn't leave. And then 31st, 1922, whatever it was, finally attacks. Back in the 1920s, there was a farmstead, Hinterkaifeck Farm, that was located in southern Germany in a very rural
go up and she would listen and it would still be tapping, but she didn't make sense of it. And then she started hearing a combination of disembodied voices and footsteps in the attic. And when she started hearing those footsteps and voices coming from the attic, she ran and told Andreas to say, hey, someone's in your attic. Andreas, even though he was skeptical, he'd go up to the attic and he would look, and not only is no one there, but it was this totally open space up there. There wasn't really anywhere to hide. There was no one up there, and there was no sign of anybody having been up there. There was no food, there was nothing. And so over the course of several weeks, the live-in maid kept saying that at night she'd be laying in bed and she would hear footsteps and voices from the attic. She'd hear tapping in the walls. She would tell Andreas, and then Andreas would be frustrated with her because he didn't really believe her, and he'd go charging up into the attic, and nothing would be there. And so she was just not having it. She'd been working with this family for a long time. She did not feel convinced that no one was there. She really thought this place was haunted. So she ultimately tells the Gruber family,
I'm sorry, I can't stay. This is the story of the Hinterkaifeck murders. Someone or something shows up on this farm and it doesn't leave. And then on March 31st, 1922, whatever it was, finally attacks. Back in the 1920s, there was a farmstead called Hinterkaifeck Farm that was located in southern Germany in a very rural, isolated, heavily forested area. So the occupants of the farm were the live-in maid, the Gruber family. The Gruber family was Andreas, his wife Azalea, daughter Victoria, and Victoria's two children, Joseph and Azalea as well. And everything was going fine for the Gruber family and for their farm until the winter of 1921. When some very strange things started happening on their property. The first one to notice strange things happening around their property was their live-in maid. She spent the majority of her time in the main house, and she went a lot of the time. And she started to notice when she was alone that she would hear tapping, what sounded like in the walls. Not someone in another room tapping, but literally something in the walls. And she would go up and she would listen, and it would still be tapping. She couldn't make sense of it. And then she started hearing a combination of disembodied voices and footsteps in the attic. And when she started hearing footsteps and voices coming from the attic, she ran and told Andreas to say, hey, someone's in your attic. Andreas would go up. Even though he was skeptical, he'd go up to the attic and he would look, and not only is no one there, but it was this totally open space up there. There wasn't really anywhere to hide. There was no one up there, and there was no sign of anybody having been up there. There's no food. There's nothing. And so over the course of several weeks, the live-in maid kept saying that at night she'd be laying in bed and she would hear footsteps and voices from the attic. She'd hear tapping in the walls. She would tell Andreas, and then Andreas, he'd be frustrated with her because he didn't really believe her, and he'd go charging up into the attic, and nothing would be there. And so she was just not having it. She'd been working with this family for a long time. She did not feel convinced that no one was there. She really thought this place was haunted. So she ultimately tells the Gruber family, like, I'm sorry, but I can't stay here another night. Whenever I'm here, I feel like I'm being watched, and at night I can't sleep because of the footsteps in the attic and these voices. I know you've checked, but I can't be here anymore. And so she quits. And it really catches the Gruber family by surprise because they rely on her help. At first, after the live-in maid had left, no one reported hearing any strange sounds around the house. But eventually, Andreas would later admit that he started hearing the tapping sounds and the footsteps in the attic and the disembodied voices, and no one's there. And so now he's becoming paranoid, and he shared his paranoia with the rest of the family, who's now also hearing these sounds and these disembodied voices and the foot. And despite checking and now searching the whole property, like they've begun to like actually do a full-blown investigation. Everyone's just stressed. They don't know what it's coming from. They're mad at each other, becoming paranoid, and so they just continue on with work and try to put it out of their mind that they're hearing these strange sounds. But the activity in the house would only intensify. What was initially just strange tapping sounds and what they thought were disembodied voices turned into things going missing around the house. Notably, a set of their house keys went missing, and there's only so many people there. Big deal to lose a set of keys, and they went missing and they couldn't find them. Once the keys went missing, the family couldn't stop thinking about the strange sounds in their house and wondering if there really was someone hiding in their house. And it was terrifying. And then when young as one of the grandchildren suddenly went missing one night, the whole family is full panic. They go out looking everywhere for her. They're yelling in the forest. They can't find her. And then finally they find her, and she has no idea how she got out, where she went, and what happened. She just was like, I don't know why I'm here. I don't know how I got out. She was exhausted. She was confused. They go back inside, and sitting on the table is a newspaper that just didn't subscribe to. No one in the family had brought. No one even in the area, it would turn out, subscribed to this particular kind of obscure newspaper. And it's just sitting in their house. A couple days after that, they noticed that someone had clearly tried to break into their tool shed, which had loads of tools in there, very expensive. There was a lock on the outside, and there was very deep gashes into the metal. It looked like someone had been, hacking away at the lock to try to break it open. But they're living in a very isolated part of Germany where there isn't much ambient sound, and so it's strange to them someone had been so violent with this lock, like hacking at this metal lock, presumably with something metal, and no one had heard it or reacted to it. None of the dogs did, nothing. So just very confusing stuff is starting to happen around the property. But it would be what Andreas sees in spring of 1922 that pushes he and his family over the edge from general paranoia to outright panic. So Andreas wakes up in early March of 1922. There was this huge snowstorm the night before. He gets up early and he goes to the back door of his house and opens it up, and he can clearly see there are footprints that have walked from the forest, which is pretty far away from his property. They have quite a bit of acreage. There's footsteps that are clearly coming out of the forest all the way up to the door that he just opened. And he's looking down at these footprints, and there's no return of tracks. And so he's thinking to himself, well, whoever walked up to my house came into the house. So he shuts the door and locks it, and immediately goes and wakes up his family and says, hey, why are there footprints leading up to the back door? Because there's no footprints going away. Someone came to the back door and apparently came inside. His wife, his daughter, the grandkids, no one has a clue. The maid, nobody knows. They say, hey, you've been asleep, we have no idea. So he opens the door back up and he's studying these footprints. He shuts the door and he walks around his house. He looks at all of the different exits to his house. So he looks to see if there's exiting footprints, which is scaring him thinking about it, which means someone would have come into the house and jumped out a window or gone out another door, but he's just checking. And as soon as he makes sure there's no other footprints, there's a scan of his entire house. Because now he's convinced that someone's in. He goes to the attic. He goes all around. He's yelling. I mean, he's looking everywhere. There's nothing. No one in the house. The family's concerned, but there's no one in the house. So he keeps everything locked, and he goes outside and he starts tracking these footprints back to where they came from. And he walks all the way to the forest, and they just kind of stop abruptly. They just started kind of magically at the edge of the tree line. So after doing one more loop around his property, he's looking everywhere, and he can't find any indication that some stranger is here. He finally decides that he's going to tell someone about what's been happening at his property. Lorenz Schlittenbauer, who was his closest neighbor, who was not really that close, but a couple hundred yards away, and he goes over and he tells Lorenz everything. My maid quit because she was hearing sounds, and he started hearing sounds. The keys go missing. There's this newspaper in my house. My granddaughter's running out in the middle of the night. She's disappearing. She doesn't know what's going on. These footprints. I can't make sense of it. And so Lorenz, also not knowing what to make of it, suggests have extra weapons. You want to take an extra rifle and arm yourself, protect yourself. And Andreas just says, you know what? No, I'm good. I'm going to pass on the rifle. Overreacting anyways, and I'm sure we're just fine. So just a couple of days after speaking with his neighbor about the weirdness happening on his property, the Gruber family got a little bit of good news. Was they finally were able to locate a maid. And so a few weeks later, on March 31st, 1922, this maid shows up in Hinterkaifeck. But unfortunately, this would also be the same date a horrible tragedy unfolds at the Hinterkaifeck farm. Over the course of 24 hours, someone or something was in the barn on Hinterkaifeck and was able to silently lure in members of the Gruber family one by one. Like anybody else what they were doing, they would walk over almost like in a trance into the barn where they would be struck in the head by something called a mattock, which is kind of like an axe. Low to the head and down. As soon as they're down, whoever was in there, whatever was in there, would take their bodies and move them to the corner and lay them down, kind of square them up against the corner of the barn, and then cover them with hay. And as soon as they were deceased, he would go, whatever it was, would go back and lure in the next person. So over a whole day, each of these members of the family are being lured into the barn where investigators, nobody knows what it was that was luring them in. They weren't scared when they went in. They're down and they would go in and then get hit in the head with this mattock until there was 4 people stacked up in the corner. And at that point, the remaining 2 people on the farm were still in the house sleeping, and whoever was doing this went into the house and used the mattock to end their lives as well. 4 days later, on April 4th, a repairman who was scheduled to come to the Hinterkaifeck farm shows up to repair the feeding machine. He goes to the door, he knocks on the door, and it's locked, and you can see lights on inside, you can hear the dog barking inside, but no one comes to greet him. Now, the feeder was outside of the main house, and it was actually on basically a public area of the farm, so he didn't need them to physically get to the feeder, and he knew how to fix it. So after trying the front door, going to the back door, looking in the windows and seeing lights, hearing the dog, but everything's locked, he just said, you know what, I'm just gonna do the job. So he goes into the area where the feeder is, he does the repair, and as he's leaving, he notices that the dog barking that was inside the house is now outside the house tied up. And so he goes over to that section of the house thinking, oh, well, now I'll knock on the door. Someone's sure to see me. And again, no one comes to the door. The back door that clearly must have just been opened is locked again. And so he's like, man, that's odd. So instead of just leaving, he goes over to Lorenz Schlittenbauer's house, the neighbor, and he says, hey, just so you know, I was just over at the Gruber family's farm. I fixed their feeder like they wanted to, but no one was there, but maybe somebody was there because the dog was inside and was outside. Don't know what's going on, but can you just let them know that I was here because I couldn't touch them. Prompts Schlittenbauer to go check on the Grubers because, they can see him in a couple days anyways, and so they figure they'll swing by and just make sure everything's okay. So they go over to Hinterkaifeck, and, the lights are on in the house, the dog sure enough is outside, the doors are locked. You see that the barn is actually open. So they go over to the barn, and in the barn, at first they don't see anything, but in the back corner underneath some hay are 4 of the bodies of the Gruber family. They go inside and find the remaining 2 bodies, and no one else is there. Although there was signs of someone recently eating in the kitchen. The fire was lit, it was like the house was being lived in at that very moment. Although to Schlittenbauer and anybody that was there, they have no way of knowing that it's been days since the Gruber family had passed away. And so they end up leaving and getting in touch with authorities. So the police show up and they're able to determine with relative certainty that the tragedy took place on March 31st. But for 4 days afterwards, someone lived in the Gruber house, slept in their beds, ate their food, lit fires, lounged around inside, they played with the dog, they milked the cows. I mean, they lived in this house. They lived on the farm for 4 days. And other neighbors can say that, yeah, we saw smoke coming out of the chimney on, April 3rd and April 2nd. And so it's confirmed that someone had been staying in this house, which is so creepy. And so the police are a little bit baffled, and they're like, okay, well then it was probably a drifter. Heard of opportunity, they probably saw this isolated farm, and they probably were going to rob them, stay there a little bit, and then leave. But when they searched the farmhouse, There were large sums of cash that were just out practically in the open, like barely hidden, that had not been taken, and anybody that was robbed the place would have taken the cash. And so probably wasn't a robbery, which leads maybe a crime of, but they were like, what's the motive? And unfortunately, Andreas was not particularly well liked in town that was nearby. And so there was lots of people that didn't like Andreas, which made it really hard to whittle it down. So they started just interviewing like crazy. They're talking to hundreds of people that were in connection with, that could be connected to this, but they're getting nowhere. They did feel like Lorenz Schlittenbauer was probably the best suspect, because he's right there, he's right next door, he's their neighbor, and in fact he had wanted to marry Victoria, the daughter, and Andreas told him outright no, and they thought that that could be a reason. But like the big issue with Lorenz Schlittenbauer being the suspect is, he had a farm to keep and a family to take care of, and so how could he have committed this crime and then ran the Hinterkaifeck farm for 4 days and lived there and slept there without his family knowing? And his family's like, no, he's been here with us. And so the police, they aren't able to prove it. They don't really have any decent suspects, and so they kind of leave it with, well, whoever did this probably had been there for about 6 months, potentially, before they committed the crime, and then stayed there for a few days afterwards and vanished. And to this day, they have not been caught. And they even reopened this case in 2007. But they found that, despite the number of suspects and despite the evidence available, it wasn't enough to provide any sort of clarity on what actually happened. So it remains a huge mystery.